Okay, so getting us started again, and just for the folks at home, we just touched on why we're having this conversation today, why this feels important. There's a lot of effort being put into distributing decision making in a lot of the organizations I work with. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations struggle with that not landing, and that can be really frustrating. And so today we're going to try and explore some of the reasons why that happens and then what we can do about it. So I wanted to start by just kind of giving us some examples of at least what I've seen in terms of the different ways that this can show up inside organizations. And hopefully this feels familiar and maybe mirrors some of the things that some of us in the room have just said. So if we think about first, what does this look like from different vantage points, from different kind of places in the organization? What we might hear from a senior leader, or what you might be thinking if you're a senior leader, is like, hey, I've been clear that this is someone's call to make, but they're not making the call and it keeps landing on my desk. Why is that happening? Like, didn't I tell you you could do it? I feel like that was one of the pieces of input that we just got here. At the middle of an organization, we might hear someone say, like, I've been told this is my decision, but the last time I tried to do this, things got weird. Either my boss jumped in at the last minute and changed everything, and that's real annoying, or my boss or someone above my boss wasn't happy with the outcome, and then I just kind of heard about it forever. And so maybe that means going forward, like, I'm going to double check everything before I make a decision, because what I don't want is to have it kind of absconded with at the end, at the last second, or to kind of hear all this grief. Yeah, consequences of taking authority. That's a great way of putting that, Jennifer. And so in this situation, middle managers don't take the power that they've been given, because they've been shown that, like, if I take that power, there are consequences that are going to come with that I don't want to have to deal with, that are at minimum annoying, and at most maybe make me feel really unsafe in my role. And then at the individual contributor level, what we might hear is like, hey, I can see something that needs to happen. I can see a decision needs to be made. It's within my domain. I've got the expertise. But the last time I tried to do something like that, or the last time my pal in the other department tried to do something like that, either suddenly I needed to get like 3 levels of approvals, and what should have been a 5-minute thing became like a 3-week thing, or I saw someone try this, or I tried this, where like they acted in a way that felt like it was within their role, but then they kind of got their hand slapped and told, no, you shouldn't have done that. And so again, in that situation, I may on paper have the authority to make that decision, but I've seen reactions that tell me I really don't have that power. And so it's better for me to just sit back. And so from a middle manager and individual contributor standpoint, that's why the things keep landing on a senior leader's desk, is because they're both saying, I do not want that hot potato. Someone please take this potato away from me. So the first pattern that I feel like I see a lot is what I call like kind of the leadership override. So we say that a decision has been distributed either through, I tell you, it's in a policy, it's in your job description, it's in a RACI, whatever. But then it gets reclaimed or re-centralized through the way that people behave and the organizational norms that support those behaviors. And so I think this is a lot of what we've already been talking about. A leader says, you decide, and then signals through how they react, maybe some second guessing, some visible frustration during the decision-making process or after, and there's some kind of consequence that it wasn't really your decision to make. And it can only take a couple rounds of this for an organization to realize that you decide actually means you come up with a first draft and then I approve it. So if I'm getting feedback that like the consequences of my decision, I don't have a leader like Anne who's going to have my back, right? Or I am visibly sort of unhappy with the direction that you're taking things, even though I've told you it's yours to take in whatever direction you want. Those are all ways of signaling that like the choice that you've made, the power that you've chosen to claim that I said I gave you wasn't really yours. And so for those reasons, people then step back and say, well, then I don't want to touch it because you've shown me that it's not really mine. And again, there's a whole spectrum of consequences here. in an organization where there isn't a lot of psychological safety, this could mean like, is this going to impact my job and my job security? Is this going to impact my relationship with my supervisor or my coworkers? So like this can have real implications where it just feels safer to say, let me defer or let me step back. So it's one pattern I see a lot, and I feel like we've kind of named that already. Another pattern that I see, I try to come up with like cute titles for these. I called the gravitational pull. And I think I see this happen in organizations that either really value expertise and like want the most biggest expert to weigh in at all times, which is often someone more senior, or in organizations where there is a genuine culture of like, I want to be helpful. I want to share my ideas. I want to help you make this the best thing that it can be. But when both of those dynamics lead to decisions being deferred to whoever in the process has the most power and or the most expertise. So one flavor of this is, let's say you've got senior leaders that are like in it, they're in the weeds, they really see themselves as like, I'm a team player, I'm here to help, we're all collaborating together. Let me just offer you some of my feedback. I have been this leader, I'm sure, to be clear. Great intentions, super helpful. The flip side is you've got a culture where there's a real deference toward expertise again, right? Where you're like, oh, we need the person who has the most knowledge to weigh in on this. Not always a bad thing. But those things often mean that we've got folks that are more senior weighing in. What this eventually ends up meaning is that whether you're the expert in that situation or the super helpful hands-on leader, if you're weighing in without attention to the power dynamics at play, what you think is like, oh, let me just be helpful. Let me just like, I'm sure they want my ideas on this. They can take them or leave them. Can they? Do they know that? And so what you think you're offering is like just a helpful whatever might be received as like, oh, that's a requirement I need to take into consideration. That's the decision that they want me to make. Okay, that's what they want me to do. Okay, I'm going to go and do it. And so even though it comes from a place of like, hey, collaboration, we're all on the same team, I'm just here to help, power dynamics often means that that's received in a really different way. And so again, even in that scenario where that's not the intention, it might be, oh, well, we've always got to involve Cassie in these conversations because she's always got an opinion and we got to make sure to include her opinion. Sorry, Cassie, I'm just picking on you. Unless you're really explicit about the context within which and the expectations within which those pieces of feedback are being offered. I'm seeing a lot of nodding there, so I feel like I might have named something familiar or recent or both. So the last pattern I see, and I was saying I'm exploring this live with a client right now where we're working around, doing some work around power and authority, is essentially where we try to delegate decision making without also delegating the accountability that comes with that decision. So here's what I mean by that. I say, Tate, I want you to make this call, but at the end of the day, am I the person who's accountable for making it happen and accountable for cleaning up the mess? Or is it Tate? If it's Tate, cool, I can delegate to Tate. Sorry, Tate, now I'm just picking on you. If it still sits with me, I have a lot of incentive to stay involved in that decision because I am the one bearing the consequences. I am the one cleaning up the mess. I am the one that's got to explain it to the board or like whatever the dynamic is. And so if I've given away the decision, but I haven't or can't give away the accountability, there's always going to be a natural draw for me to keep my hands involved and to keep kind of sticking my nose in, which makes sense because I've got to deal with the consequences. And so that's a little bit more complicated because what it means is either you have to think about how does real accountability for outcomes also get shifted? Or if you can't shift accountability, then maybe that decision can't move either. Because giving someone decision-making authority but not ultimate accountability, it's just not a dynamic that's going to survive. And so I think, Jennifer, that gets a little bit to what you were saying earlier. Yeah, I think that gets a little bit to what you were saying earlier. So I want to pause there and see if folks want to react or ask about that at all. And then we'll dive in a bit to like what some of the underlying causes behind this and what do we do about them. So let me talk a little bit about at least why I think some of this happens. And I'd love to hear from all of you because I'm sure you're going to have things that I have not thought of. The thing I wanted to start with is that, and I think we all know this, that decision-making cultures are built subconsciously over time by an organizational culture, by a set of organizational dynamics. Whatever norms that you accumulate, processes you've put in place, leadership behaviors that stick, whatever it is, we build these patterns. And often these patterns encourage people to look up before they make a decision for all the reasons that we've named. And I'm going to get into a little bit more about that in a minute. And I think as we've talked about here, it's not because people are incompetent or because they lack initiative. It's because for whatever reason, we've designed a system that says, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how it's safe to behave. When I was in school, we got told this story that I now think is not true. I don't think it's real, but I still think it's a good story to tell. But there's this metaphor where they say that these researchers were working with a group of monkeys. Have we heard the monkeys in the hose story before? Okay, it's a little weird, but bear with me. We're going to assume that these monkeys really like. Oh, never mind. I don't think there's any way I can make this friendly to monkeys. So assume we've got some monkeys in a cage. We put a banana in the cage. A monkey goes to reach for the banana. All the monkeys get sprayed with a hose. Put another banana in the cage. Different monkey reaches for the banana. All the monkeys get sprayed with a hose. Third banana you put in the cage, the monkeys are like, we're not dumb. We're not touching that banana. Okay, so now all those monkeys have learned we don't touch the banana. Now, if you swap out one of those monkeys and bring in a new monkey and put a banana in the cage, new monkey's like, hey, a banana. No one else wants this. I'm going to grab the banana. You don't need to spray the monkeys with the hose because the other monkeys are like, dude, we don't touch the banana. You throw that banana out of the cage, and the new monkey has no idea why, but the new monkey has learned we don't touch the banana. And so over time, the story goes, you can swap out all the monkeys and you have a cage full of monkeys that have never experienced the hose, but also know that you don't touch the banana. I think that's a lot of how organizational culture works because we learn these norms and they become embedded to a point where we don't know why we're doing that anymore. But at some point we decided that was how we had to behave to survive. And now that's just how things are around here. And that is really hard to unlearn. We'd have to have a whole conversation with these monkeys about positive conditioning and bananas to move them out of that sort of trauma. And there's also a neuroscience component to this, both in terms of we've got the way the organizational system encourages existing patterns, but our brains are like that too. Once we establish a pattern of behavior, once those neural pathways are established, I like to joke that our brains are lazy. They have so many things to do that they always want the most efficient pathway. So if they've got an established neural pathway on how something gets done, they always want to default to that versus building the new neural connections to try something new. And so when we're trying to shift things, we're not just asking the system to behave in new ways, we're actually asking people to literally rewire your brains in real time, which is really challenging. And it's especially challenging if you're also fighting that am I safe to do this? Is this okay? Am I going to get in trouble this time? So there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to push up against old patterns, old behaviors, old norms, even if we don't quite understand why they're there or if they don't make any sense anymore. So that said, I think there are, based on the examples that we went through in terms of the patterns, I think there are 3 things that need to be true for distributed decision-making to actually stick. And I think this starts to get into what do we do about this? One of them is structural delegation, meaning we have established a formal system that says these people are responsible for this thing. So that might be done through an org chart or your org design. That might be reflected in your job descriptions. It might be documented in something like a RACI tool or some other kind of decisional rubric, but it's essentially what have we written down that articulates who has power over what. So that's one piece, is we've got to have that in place that says what we intend. The second piece is that your behavior and norms need to align with what you say you want to happen. So if we say things are like this, but actually every time we try to make this decision, Dorothy leans in and snatches it from someone, we've already got it in the structure, but behaviorally, it's not sticking. And that means we become an organization where what we've written down, what we said doesn't matter. What matters is how we behave. We've all lived through those things. Super frustrating. And then the third piece is what we were just talking about, the alignment between accountability and authority. So however far down we want to distribute decision making, we also need to think about how we distribute accountability as well. And so if we want to give someone a decision, but we can't also share accountability for that, no matter what the structural delegation system looks like, no matter what our intentions behaviorally are, it's not going to make sense because someone else is bearing the consequences for my actions. And so they're going to get involved in my actions because they're the ones that have to deal with it, not me. And so only through the alignment of these three things can you actually delegate decisions in a way that they will stick. And so if one of these things isn't happening, you're going to revert back to who's the safest person that can make the call, the most senior person with the highest degree of expertise, the person with the most opinions, whatever that is. Now, I'm curious, these are things that I've seen, but again, like, I only know what I know. I'm curious if there are other conditions that you've seen be necessary for decisional delegation to like actually happen. One of the other things that, thinking about, Jennifer, your comment about risk appetite, the last webinar I did was around, I've been thinking a lot about decision making lately, disentangling process participation and process decision making. I think sometimes we conflate those two things and then we end up in kind of messy situations. And one of the things I talked about there is that sometimes you don't want a very inclusive decision-making process because there is a really high degree of risk that is really tied to one individual person's role, in which case you don't want a committee weighing in. Like there are good reasons to hold some decisions in one role or to have them be more targeted in nature. And so I appreciate kind of, Jennifer, you connecting that to this too, that relates to accountability, that in some organizations, accountability needs to be held by one person. In some cases, that is due to legal or fiduciary risk. And so if we try to push that out, it probably won't work or have consequences. So the last couple slides I had are just on how could you take this forward? Like, okay, we've talked a lot about how to look at some of these different patterns and what might be happening underneath them in terms of these three conditions and if they're not present. I'll circulate these slides after. So if there's something here that is helpful to you, you'll have all this in writing. But I pulled together some questions that might help you kind of get at the root of like, okay, I can see people playing hot potato with decisions, but I'm not quite sure why. And so these questions asked of yourself or asked of your colleagues or asked of your team might help you figure that out. So the first question is, when someone makes a decision that is within their stated authority, it's in my job description or I'm the name on the RACI, what happens next? I make the decision, then what? How does leadership actually respond? How do they respond when it goes south or when something happens that we didn't expect? Oh, I'm glad you like that, Melanie. For what it's worth, I did a whole webinar on that a month ago that's also on my website. So if like that's the kind of thing that gets you excited, then I talk about that for a whole hour.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So second question, how often do senior leaders offer their input on decisions that formally sit with someone else? I know this is your decision, but have you thought about, oh, I had this idea, best intentions. When that happens, how is that input treated? Is it treated like a requirement or is it treated like, okay, cool, that's what you think. I'll add that to the pile and then I'll make a decision. Third question, when a decision doesn't go well, who ends up dealing with the consequences? And is it the same person who made the call? If the answer is no, it means we might have a separation between accountability and decisional authority. And then finally, would senior leaders describe their involvement in others' decisions as helping? And would other people also use that word? Or would they use a different word? So if you're asking yourself these questions or you're asking your team some questions, am I missing a slide here? Hang on. Sorry, I'm going to jump real quick. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I reordered this deck this morning and now I'm not happy about it. So if you ask yourself these questions, you ask your team these questions, you'll get back to one of those three patterns or some combination of those patterns, right? The leadership override, that gravitational pull, or the mismatch between accountability and decisional authority. And so these are some of the ways that we can think about how we manage that. So if you get to, oh, this is about people overriding, they're stepping into like either actively or some or kind of, I don't mean subversively in a bad way, but like informally, they're saying, I wasn't happy with what you did. I'm not happy with the outcomes. Are you sure you want to do it that way? Then you know that your work is behavioral in nature. How do leaders manage their behaviors as it relates to decisions that other people hold? So I think, Dorothy, going back to your question, what signals are we sending when a decision doesn't go the way that we've chosen? How do we, to Jennifer, to your point, how are we responding to risk and when we do things that are risky? Are we leaving space for things to play out? Or are we like jumping in as soon as we think things are going off track? So those are all some things that you can work on at the behavioral level, specifically at the leadership level, to say, okay, if we really want to delegate decisions here, we've got to slow our roll a little bit and really let people hold the work. If you're seeing that like gravitational pull dynamic where it's like, oh, we're just being helpful, and suddenly we're making decisions by, not by committee, but by, we're deferring to whoever is sort of the most helpful, most senior voice in the room. This goes back to that post-it note, building awareness of positional power and the positional power that we always carry with us, whether we like it or not. If we are in a position where we have control over someone's mortgage and healthcare, we have positional power, and that's going to influence how they interact with us, unless we are really intentional about being explicit about what our expectations are. And then the third category is this accountability mismatch, which comes back to your structural design. Where have you put accountability structurally in your organization? And is it the same place where you're putting decisional authority? And if it's not, one of those two things has to move. So hopefully the idea is that this gives you a little bit of a path to think about, okay, if I'm seeing some combination of these patterns, do I need to work on the behavior with which our leaders show up with and participate in decision-making processes, the norms that we have in our culture around how decisions get made, how our organizational design and roles are structured. And I'm just going to share one more slide, and then I figure we can pause and have a bit of a chat. We've kind of already touched on this already. I think there's a lot of pressure in our sector right now, which in some ways I think can be a good thing, to delegate power and share power and push power down. And I think that gets us in the long term a lot of good things in terms of ownership, in terms of role satisfaction, in terms of actually doing good work, because we're letting the people that are closest to the work make decisions about that work. Like all of these things are good things. But I also don't think that means that every decision has to be pushed down. And as we talked about at the beginning of the call, I think some of where we experience frustration is not just, I don't have access to a decision that I want to have access to, but it's the mismatch between, well, you said I have access to this decision, but I actually don't. And so in some cases, the it might be it might be tempting to say, yeah, you can make that decision, but then I'm going to swoop in and change it, and that's going to be annoying for us all. The better choice in that moment is to say, I can't delegate that decision. And you might not be happy about that, but at least you're not also suffering the frustration of feeling like it's been a bait and switch and I haven't been honest with you, intentionally or unintentionally. And so I think part of the work here too is just being explicit about where we can delegate and where, because of reasons of accountability or risk or role definition, it just doesn't make sense. And we'll be open about that. Sharing my last slide here. If there's something that we talked about that like you want to keep chatting about, I do pro bono office hours that are essentially like, hey, do you want to talk about something you're working on? Because I just have fun talking with people about this stuff. So if like having a thought partner on something in terms of advancing this work would be valuable. There's a link in the chat and on the screen for you to use, and you're welcome to do that. And then this is something that I do monthly. I am so open to feedback. I really want these to feel useful. And so if there's something I did or didn't do that would, if I changed it, would make this more effective, I'd love to hear about it. And if you have suggestions for the kinds of topics that you'd be interested in digging into, I'd welcome that feedback too.